Hello, I'm Marieke van Beurden. In this video, I will show you how to turn a classic cake, the Black Forest, into a beautiful deconstructed dessert. You will learn how to make a pâte à bombe by using fruit puree. Balance the bitterness of an intense dark chocolate with cherry puree. Prepare a cake with different layers of textures and flavors, and how to mold a chocolate crémeux into elegant leaves to decorate your plate. Let's get our hands dirty in the Black Forest! The first component is the chocolate SABLE. For this recipe, we will need these ingredients: 100 grams of soft butter, 85 grams icing sugar, 80 grams egg yolks, 40 grams of cocoa powder, 200 grams cake flour. For this recipe, we will need these utensils: mix the soft butter and the icing sugar in a tabletop mixer on low speed. Then add the egg yolks, followed by the flour and the cocoa powder, and continue mixing until the texture is completely smooth. Place the dough onto a plastic sheet or parchment paper and cover it with a second one. Then, using a rolling pin, roll into both directions until obtaining a very thin layer of around 2 mm thick. Freeze until solid enough to be cut. Then remove from the freezer. Remove both sheets and cut into squares of 4 by 4 cm using a knife and a ruler. It is important to cut the dough on a cold tray, otherwise the dough will warm up too quickly and you will not have enough time to work it. Then, place the pieces of dough on a silicone mat with holes. The silicone mat is used to prevent the dough to move during the baking and to ensure that they all keep a nice and square shape. Bake at 150 degrees Celsius during 10 minutes. Here you see that the pieces of dough have kept a nice square shape. Let's move on to the cherry marmalade. For this recipe, we will need these ingredients: 400 grams of IQF sour cherry, 40 grams of sugar, 5 grams of pectin and H. For this recipe, we will need these utensils: mix the pectin and the sugar together. In the meantime, heat the cherries to 40 degrees Celsius. Once the cherries reach 40 degrees Celsius, add the pectin and the sugar mixture. Bring to boil. Transfer into a bowl and cover with plastic film. Place into the fridge until fully cooled down. We can now prepare the vanilla velvet mousse. For this recipe, we will need these ingredients: 125 grams of milk, 1½ piece of vanilla beans, 240 grams of Callebaut velvet white chocolate, 30 grams of gelatin mass, 250 grams of heavy cream 35%. For this recipe, we will need these utensils: place the milk into the saucepan, scrape the vanilla seeds out of the bean and add them into the pan. Bring to boil. Add the gelatin mass and mix until completely melted. Strain the vanilla seeds out of the preparation over the chocolate, and then by using an immersion blender, mix until completely smooth. Let the preparation cool down to 28 to 30 degrees Celsius. Combine the preparations with the whipped cream. Then pour onto a frame that has been previously lined with plastic film. Remove the excess preparation by using a scraper and a palette knife. Freeze until solid enough to be unmolded and cut. Then, using a knife, cut the mousse into small squares. Place the squares of mousse back into the freezer until the assembly. Let's move on to the crumble. For this recipe, we will need these ingredients: 110 grams of sugar, 65 grams of butter, 5 grams salt, 25 grams eggs, 40 grams of flour, 35 grams of Callebaut cocoa powder. For this recipe, we will need these utensils. Place the butter, the salt and the sugar into the mixing bowl. Using the tabletop mixer, mix on medium speed and slowly add the eggs. Stop mixing and add the flour and the cocoa powder. Start mixing again until all the ingredients are well incorporated. After, pour the dough onto a silicone mat and spread it out by using a palette knife until obtaining a thin layer. Bake at 170 degrees Celsius during 20 minutes. Once baked, let the crumble cool down. And then cut into pieces using the food processor. Save some big pieces to decorate the dessert at the end. Time to prepare the crisp. For this recipe, we will need these ingredients: 100 grams cacao barry pailleté feuilletine, 130 grams Callebaut sautemé dark chocolate, 100 grams Callebaut hazelnut praline, 40 grams salted chocolate crumble. For this recipe, we will need these utensils. Mix the melted chocolate and hazelnut praline together. Add the pailleté feuilletine and the salted chocolate crumble and continue mixing. Then pour the preparation onto a plastic sheet. Cover with a second one. And by using a rolling pin, roll the dough to 2 to 3 mm thickness. Place onto a metal tray and let it set at room temperature. Then peel off the plastic sheet on the top and cut squares. Let's move on to the crème. For this recipe, we will need these ingredients: 110 grams heavy cream 35% fat, 110 grams cherry puree, 100 grams Callebaut sautemé dark chocolate, 45 grams egg yolks, 10 grams sugar, 60 grams Callebaut ARRIBA milk chocolate. For this recipe, we will need these utensils. Using the thermomixer, heat the cream, cherry puree, egg yolks and sugar to 82 degrees. Then add the chocolate and mix well until obtaining a smooth crémeux. Please note that because of the usage of fruit puree, some cherry texture will always remain in your crémeux. Transfer into a bowl and then using a spoon, fill the leaf mold. Make sure that the entire mold is evenly filled. Remove the excess crémeux using a palette knife. We can now make the pâte à bombe. For this recipe, we will need these ingredients: 110 grams cherry puree, 175 grams egg yolks, 175 grams sugar. For this recipe, we will need these utensils. Heat the cherry puree, the egg yolks and the sugar to 82 degrees in the thermomixer. Then place into a mixing bowl and whip on high speed until the preparation holds 10 peaks. Rescale to 150 grams to use in the cherry mousse. Time to prepare the cherry gel. For this recipe, we will need these ingredients: 400 grams cherry puree, 25 grams gel crème cold. For this recipe, we will need these utensils. Place the cherry puree into the food processor. Add the gel crème in 2 different additions and mix until completely smooth. Scale 150 grams for the cherry mousse and place the remainder in a piping bag with a 3 mm tip. Let's make the mousse. For this recipe, we will need these ingredients: 150 grams pâte à bombe, 80 grams cherry puree, 190 grams Callebaut Sauté dark chocolate, 275 grams heavy cream 35% fat, 160 grams cherry gel. For this recipe, we will need these utensils. Whip the cream on high speed until the preparation holds soft peaks. In the meantime, bring the cherry puree to a boil. Once boiling, mix with the chocolate to obtain a smooth ganache, which should be at 45 degrees Celsius. Then add the cherry gel and mix well. Make sure the cherry gel is not used straight out of the fridge, otherwise it will crystallize the ganache. Add the pâte à bombe and barely mix it. Be careful not to overmix the preparation before adding the whipped cream. And then add the whipped cream in 2 additions and mix until fully incorporated and completely smooth. Transfer into a piping bag and cut the small tip off to control the flow. Immediately pipe into the mold. Make sure to leave enough space in the middle of the mold for the rest of the assembly. Using a palette knife, spread the mousse evenly on the sides and at the bottom of the mold to ensure that there are no air bubbles. Then mix the cherry marmalade again and place it into the mold on top of the mousse. And place a square of vanilla velvet into each of the cavities. Cover with a thin layer of cherry chocolate mousse and remove the excess mousse using a palette knife. Place a square of chocolate crisp onto the mousse layer and clean well using the palette knife. Place into the blast freezer until solid enough to be unmolded. The next component is the glaze. For this recipe, we will need these ingredients: 210 grams sugar, 100 grams water, 160 grams heavy cream 35% fat, 100 grams glucose syrup, 50 gram Callebaut cocoa powder, 65 gram gelatin mass, 0.5 gram IBC creative gold powder. For this recipe, we will need these utensils. Mix the cream, glucose and cocoa powder to the boil. Then cook the water and the sugar to 115 degrees Celsius. Once the sugar syrup has reached 115 degrees Celsius, quench with the hot cream preparation. Press the glaze through the strainer into a bowl to ensure that all the cocoa powder remains into the glaze. Cool the glaze down to 70 degrees. Add the gelatin mass and mix well using an immersion blender. Here it is important to let the glaze cool down to 70 degrees and below before adding the gelatin mass in order to avoid air bubbles. Add the gold powder and mix using the immersion blender. The glaze should reach 35 degrees Celsius and be very smooth without any lumps. Transfer the glaze into a piping bag and cut a small tip off to control the flow. Unmold the cubes of cherry chocolate mousse. Place them onto a rack and glaze them. Then, using a skewer, clean the excess glaze and place on top of a chocolate SABLE square. The final component is the vanilla chantilly. For this recipe, we will need these ingredients: 500 g heavy cream, 35% fat, 10 g sugar, 1 piece vanilla bean. For this recipe, we will need these utensils: scrape the seeds out of the vanilla beans and place them into the cream. Then, place into a mixing bowl. Add the sugar. Whisk until the preparation holds stiff peaks. Transfer into a piping bag with a 5 mm tip. Time to plate the dessert. For this recipe, we will need these ingredients: Mona Lisa dark curled shavings, IBC gold powder, cherries. For this recipe, we will need these utensils: using a palette knife, gently place the cubes of mousse onto the plate. Place the frozen molded leaves in between. Add the curls onto the cake and pipe dots of cherry gel and vanilla chantilly. Place pieces of chocolate crisp onto the plate and finish with a cherry. Your plated dessert is now ready to be served and enjoyed. In this course, you have learned how to revamp a classic cake, balance the different textures and flavors of several ingredients, use decorations to perfect your dessert. All the different components are versatile, so be creative and use them in different recipes. And please share your creations on our social media platforms, so I can see what you have been up to. I hope you had fun and learned a lot following my course. Check out my other plated dessert recipes.